and record.
Okay, so should I start, Tia, as you say?
Yeah,
Please
if
do.
you can actually redirecting to YouTube, and yes, please go for it.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Kashshaf Ghani is an assistant professor of history at Nalanda University. He specializes in pre-modern South Asian history with a focus on Sufism, its practices, interactions, and networks. His interests in teaching and research also covers Indo-Persian history, cosmopolitan cultures, South Asian interconnections with West and Central Asia, and Muslim networks through travel and trans-regionalism. His forthcoming monograph explores Sufi rituals and devotional practices in medieval South Asia. He has edited Imagining Asia, Networks, Actors, Sites, ISEAS Yusuf Ishak Institute, Singapore 2019. Dr. Kashshaf Ghani was trained in history at Presidency College and the University of Calcutta. He has held doctoral research positions at the Asiatic Society, Kolkata, postdoctoral research positions at the University of Sorbonne Nouvelle, Paris, the Centrum Moderner Orient, Berlin, and Maulana Abul Kalam Azad Institute of Asian Studies, Kolkata. Over to you, Dr. Farhat Hassan, sir.
Now, over to Kashshaf. Kashshaf, why don't you start and then we can have the discussion later.
Sure. Thank you, Soumya, for the kind introduction. And thank you to the Department of History, Delhi University, for the very kind invitation to this seminar series and allowing me to share this essay of mine with everybody in the community, faculty, students, friends, colleagues. This essay is a work in progress, and I'm still working on the drafts and making additions and corrections, alterations, so that ideas, I suppose, will still take a bit of a time to settle down and get consolidated. For today's talk, however, I have tried to keep things simple. I'll focus on 4 themes in a chronological order, beginning from the earliest arrival of Sufis in Bengal during the 13th century, moving on to the role of the Chishtis in state formation around the 14th and the 15th centuries, followed by the writing of Sufi literature in the 16th in a combination with the Bengali esoteric traditions. And finally, if time permits, then focusing on the cult of the Pir around the 17th. So this is the structure that I have planned for today's talk to keep things simple. I will read out the paper that I have prepared, and then, as Professor Hassan said, we can have the discussion. Before I begin, just a brief inquiry with Professor Hassan regarding the amount of time I have with me for the presentation.
Well, I guess about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we can have the discussion. That'd be good.
Okay.
Is that how it is with other lectures too, Pia?
Yes, sir, that's perfect. We can stretch it to about 5 o'clock with questions.
Right. Lovely, lovely. Okay, then go ahead, Kashshaf.
Yeah, thank you. The arrival of Sufis in Bengal followed the pattern of an eastward movement of Turkish armies after arriving in North India from regions beyond the Punjab. Over the early decades of the 13th century, the sway of the Turkish military authority was ensured over the Gangetic Doab. With the defeat of the Sena ruling house, free-floating military commanders like Bakhtiyar Khilji planted Turkish authority in the geographical frontiers like Bengal, halted by the dense forests of eastern Bengal and the mountains beyond. Muslim political authority would continue with some interruptions for centuries thereafter till the arrival of the British. A new cultural world, originating in northern Iran, carrying Persianate values, was introduced in a predominantly Buddhist and Hindu society of Bengal. This world came to be sustained by a continuous flow of immigrants through a corridor that connected Bengal to the frontiers of Afghanistan and beyond with Central Asia. Lured by an expanding Persianate frontier, carrying political, cultural, and economic prospects, combined with the push factor of large-scale disruption caused by the Mongol outburst in Central Asia, these immigrants, scholars, soldiers, Sufis, bureaucrats, poets, passed through northern India, arriving into Western Bengal. Immigrants in the form of Sufis, scholars, and the elite had started to settle down in the urban centers from the early period, leading to the establishment of newer ones. While many chose to move eastwards from Delhi, others arrived from areas beyond Lahore and Punjab, drawn by the promise of a lucrative career in one of the many urban centers. When the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, after holding many positions under the Tughlaq regime in Delhi, arrived in Bengal in the 14th century, he saw numerous Muslim mystics in the capital city of Pandua. Alongside, Sufi saints from the Surawardi and Chishti orders were some of the earliest to arrive in the region. Shah Jalal Mujarrad, the Surawardi Sufi, moved as deep as the mountainous areas of Sylhet in the forested parts of northern Bengal. These saintly personalities not only attracted other immigrants to the region, yet at the same time created a social class who were spiritually elite on the one hand, legitimizing the newly established ruling dynasties, while successfully strengthening the social bond with local inhabitants through practices of piety and social welfare. Such activities were carried out effectively through the establishment of institutions like the Khanka, along with the mosque and the madrasa. Gradually, urban centers like Sadgaon, Pandua, and Sonargaon began to perform multiple roles as centers of the Sultanate administration, hub of spiritual practice, piety, and learning. Shah Jalal settled in Sylhet, Shah Safiuddin in Sadgaon, Zafar Khan established a madrasa in Tribeni, and Sheikh Badr in Chittagong. Sheikh Jalaluddin Tabrizi and Sheikh Nur Qutbi Alam established their Khankas in Pandua. This network of early Sufi saints and the institution of the Khanka firmly entrenched the practice of Islamic spirituality in the region, drawing the common masses towards a spiritual tradition which was unique to the area, who saw Sufi saints as holy men, complementing their extant cults of deities in the Bengal Delta. Practices of cultural interaction between Sufism and the world of these folk cults in the Delta will take interesting forms by the 16th century. From the early days of the Delhi Sultanate, charismatic Sufi saints, particularly the Chishtis in Delhi and the Surawardis in Punjab, played a crucial role in legitimizing the newly established state. The practice was built on a long-standing tradition in the Persianate world, where Sufi saints were seen as the friend of God, wali, and hence the ones entrusted with quote-unquote real authority in this worldly creation. From time to time, these Sufi saints would lease out worldly authority to sultans by blessing their rule through the act of building a khanka or taking up residence within the sultanate. Successive dynasties of the Delhi Sultanate followed this policy of enlisting support from the powerful Chishti saints, who in turn would bless the sultan and appoint deputies in various provinces under the political authority of the sultanate. The saint who institutionalized this practice was none other than Delhi's premier Sufi master, Nizamuddin Auliya. Not only did the latter survive 7 consecutive sultans of Delhi, his disciples like Burhanuddin Garib were sent to Khuldabad in the Deccan, close to the newly established Tughlaq capital of Daulatabad. Later, when the Bahmanis rebelled against the Tughlaqs in Delhi, carrying out an independent sultanate, it was Burhanuddin's successor, Zainuddin Shirazi, who blessed the nascent state in the Deccan. This is illustrative of a practice which could actually cut both ways, where parent sultanates as well as rebel sultanates could draw the succor of legitimacy from the same pool of Sufi spiritual charisma. Something similar would also unfurl in the context of medieval Bengal as well. One of the earliest Sufis to arrive in the region of Bengal was Sheikh Jalaluddin Tabrizi. Born in Tabriz in northwestern Iran, Jalaluddin studied Sufism under Sheikh Abu Sa'id Tabrizi, and after his death, migrated to Baghdad in the early 13th century, where after 7 years, he completed his spiritual training under the able guidance of the renowned Suravadi master, Sheikh Shihabuddin Suravadi. The saint first came to Delhi, but due to differences with the Shaykhul Islam Najimuddin Sugra, he left Delhi and moved to Lucknowti in the early 13th century. His Khanka in Devtala near Pandua introduced the Suravadi order in Bengal. One of the earliest accounts of the Sheikh comes from the pen of Jamali Siyarul Arifin, written almost 3 centuries after the death of the saint, around the middle of the 13th century. The work narrates the arrival of the saint in Bengal, where, I quote, all the population came to him and became his disciples. There he built a hospice and a public kitchen and brought several lands that would act as sources of revenue to fuel the establishment. There was a river port called the Dev Mahal, which had a temple on its site, built at a great cost. Sheikh Jalaluddin Tabrizi destroyed the temple and in its place built a rest house or a takia and converted many infidels to the folds of Islam. At the time of writing of this book, in the early decades of the 16th century, his holy resting place still lay at the very site of the temple, and half of the income from the port was earmarked for the maintenance of the public kitchen or the langar. Close quotes. Another important Sufi saint arriving in Bengal from the west was Shah Jalal Mujarrad, who lay buried in Sylhet and is Bengal's most revered Sufi. We get an account of his life and activities from a text called the Shar-i-Nuzhatul Arwa, written in the mid-16th century by an individual Sheikh Ali Sher, a descendant of a close companion of the Sufi saint. This account was later incorporated into the 17th century hagiographic corpus of the Gulzar-i-Abrar. Written centuries after the demise of the saint in the mid-14th century, this narration locates Shah Jalal as a resident of Central Asia, trained under Sheikh Ahmed Yasavi, from where he and his followers moved to South Asia, before continuing to move further east towards Bengal. The account states that his real intention of moving towards the east was to fulfill the desire of complementing his success in the greater jihad, that of purifying and enlightening the soul, through the means of undertaking the lesser jihad, that of striving against infidels and serving the cause of Islam. Shah Jalal received the blessings and support from his master in the form of 700 disciples who accompanied the saint towards Bengal till they reached Sylhet with a little over 300 men, eventually conquering the town. However, historically, it needs to be noted that an inscription from the Sylhet town makes it clear that a certain commander, Sikandar Khan Ghazi, conquered the area in the early 14th century. Importantly, and quite interestingly, we also have a contemporary non-hagiographical source on Shah Jalal from the account of the famous Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta. Battuta met the saint in around the mid-14th century at his mountain cave near Sylhet, where the latter had grown quite old and at the same time greatly renowned across and beyond Bengal. In the words of the wayfarer, as you can see on the screen, I will not read it out. I will move ahead. Together with the above, Battuta, familiar with Sufi personalities, did not forget to leave an account of the miracles of Sheikh Jalal, which he witnessed or heard from the Sheikh's disciples. Firstly, when he was approaching the reciting place of the Sheikh in the mountains of Sylhet, he met 4 of Sheikh Shah Jalal's disciples, whom the Sheikh had sent, saying that a traveler from the west will be arriving and you should go to meet him. Battuta was alarmed by the fact that all his affairs have been revealed to the Sheikh. Once during his stay, he met Shah Jalal in his meditation cell, where the Sheikh was seated wearing a large coat made of goat skin. This caught the fancy of Ibn Battuta, who wished the Sheikh gave the coat to him. At the time of the departure, Shah Jalal took off the coat and handed it over to the visitor while donning a patched cloak himself. The disciples of the Sheikh told Ibn Battuta that their master had told them, "The Maghribi, I quote, will ask for this coat and it shall be taken away from him by a non-Muslim king who will give it to our brother Burhanuddin, to whom it belongs and for whom it is intended." Close quotes. Battuta recalls in his account that long afterwards, when he was traveling in China, he was taken to the palace of the king, where the king demanded the same coat. But Battuta had to hand it over. Later, when he visited the hermitage of Sheikh Burhanuddin, he found the Sheikh busy reading with the same coat on. The Sheikh then said to Ibn Battuta that his brother Shah Jalal had written to him long before that this coat would reach him through such and such hands. Battuta was awestruck at Shah Jalal's spiritual prowess and the ability to foretell things well before their occurrence. While contemporary sources on early Sufi activities in Bengal during the 13th and the 14th centuries sketch an image of saints like Jalaluddin Tabrizi and Shah Jalal as Sufis and immigrants who neither led holy wars against the resident population nor undertook any large-scale destruction of temples and religious sites, it is interesting to observe that these very individuals portrayed in the image of quote-unquote warrior Sufis in hagiographies produced from the 16th century onwards, at a considerable gap from the time from where these saints lived and preached. We see that for Sheikh Jalaluddin Tabrizi in the 16th century Persian text of Jamali and Sheikh Ali's work on Shah Jalal. Continuing thereafter, two non-extant manuscripts from the 17th century were used to create another account on the career of Shah Jalal by a certain Nasiruddin Haidar of Sylhet. The text is called the Suhaili Yaman, a Persian hagiography written in the mid-19th century. This account writes the full name of the saint as Shah Jalal Mujarrad Yamani, born in Yemen, brought up and trained in the Sufi path by his uncle Sayyid Ahmed Kabir Surawardi, himself a reputed saint. After finishing his training, Shah Jalal was given a lump of earth and asked to travel east, spreading Islam along the way, till he reached the place where the earth matched the one he was carrying, signaling his final destination. According to the Suhail, Shah Jalal's resolve to settle in Sylhet was fueled by the necessity to establish the hegemony of Islam in a non-Islamic land. The details of his actions in Sylhet have been presented in a garb of a story meant to justify in the name of religion his confrontation and eventual triumph over the local non-Muslim ruler. Shah Jalal's battle against the local ruler with a little over 300 followers has been justified in the hagiographical account as a drive towards fulfilling the responsibility of propagation and teaching, as well as to unfurl the flag of Islam in a land where injustice was meted to the followers of the faith. At the same time, such an act also satiated the ideological hunger for jihad, which in turn seemed to enhance his spiritual prowess. Duly, he is credited with spreading Islam in eastern Bengal and large parts of Assam as the most successful torchbearer of Islam among Sufis. His memory is enshrined as part of the eastern Bengal oral folk tradition. Our final account of Sufi saints taking recourse to warfare in order to spread Islam in Bengal comes from the region of southwestern Bengal. The text was written in the mid-19th century from the pen of a certain Muhyiddin Ustagar, titled Shah Sufi Sultan, or the Account of Pandua. Shah Sufiuddin, after completing his training under Bu Ali Shah Kalandar in Panipat, arrived and settled in Hugli Pandua near Tribeni sometime in the late 13th century. The handful of Muslim inhabitants at that time had to suffer under the might of the local Hindu ruler. When matters one day came to a head regarding the celebration of childbirth, the saint had little option but to appeal to his uncle Sultan Firoz Shah in Delhi. Probably Sultan Jalaluddin Firoz Khilji, who ruled between 1290s and the early 1300s. The Sultan sent help under a certain commander, Zafar Khan. The army finally defeated the local ruler, and some fakirs succeeded in polluting the waters of the well of life that supposedly made the dead turn alive. Shah Sufiuddin died in the battle and was buried in Pandua itself. After the victory, royal structures were demolished and a large mosque constructed on the site by Zafar Khan in 1298, together with a lofty minaret. Contemporary evidence of Zafar Khan's presence in Bengal comes from the inscription of his mosque, which narrates his exploits in the land of southern Bengal. Zafar Khan's claims of destroying the local ruler is corroborated by evidence of extensive reuse of architectural materials from abundant Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain sites in order to construct the mosque and his own mausoleum as a separate structure in the early 14th century, whose foundation and panel embeddings bear Hindu, Buddhist, and Vaishnava engravings. In the late 13th and early 14th century, during the consecutive reigns of Sultan Ruknuddin and Sultan Shamsuddin Firoz Shah, Zafar Khan built madrasas and mosques for the spread of education in the region. The inscription of his mosque records Zafar Khan's contribution for reviving the institutions of the faith and also elevating the standards of the scholars and those of the virtuous. These institutions came to be recognized as the Darul Khairat, or the houses of charity. So, such later day articulations of Sufi personalities as warrior saints in popular hagiography reflect a trend of how historical memory concerning the arrival of Sufis came to function primarily along lines of the propagation of faith. These later day legends with minimal historical references can perhaps also be seen as specimens of origin narratives, as they claim to capture the history of the early Muslim conquests in Bengal, led by Sufi saints who took recourse to warfare to defeat the reigning local Hindu ruler. These biographers, irrespective of their familiarity with the concept of Sufi vilayat, chose to imagine early saints arriving in Bengal with a mandate which corresponded to the idea of jihad as limited only to military confrontation. Destruction of the temples, imperial sites, construction of khanqahs, mosques, as well as the forcible conversion of the local population were actions that these later biographers willfully attached to these holy men, in the absence of any such evidence from contemporary records. What becomes evident, therefore, is a distinct ideology of conflict and conversion with which later generations of hagiographers had grown familiar, and in turn chose to project it backwards onto the lives of their chosen heroes. Moving on to the next section, where we explore the role of Sufis in the process of state formation in medieval Bengal. The historical narrative of this period centers around the contribution made by the Chishtis in medieval Bengal, attaching them firmly to the process whereby political entities across provinces like Deccan and also in Bengal chose to style themselves on the model of independent sultanates. Ironically, by renouncing the authority of the very parent sultanates in Delhi, from whom they borrowed this model. These sultanates, in most cases, as if by routine, came to be blessed by charismatic Sufi saints, primarily from India's premier silsila, the Chishtis. In this project of creating a Chishti network across the Indian subcontinent, the visionary, as we mentioned previously, was none other than Delhi's famous Sufi saint, Nizamuddin Auliya. A disciple of the saint, Aki Sirajuddin Usman, would repeat the same process which his earlier disciple, Burhanuddin Garib, had done for the Deccan. At a young age, Sirajuddin had traveled to Delhi to train himself with Nizamuddin. He followed that up with additional training in the Islamic sciences from Maulana Fakhruddin Zarradi, himself a senior and reputed disciple of Nizamuddin. Thereafter, Aki Siraj was conferred with the title of the Aina in Hindustan, or the Mirror of Hindustan, given the cloak of spiritual succession, which signaled his final departure to Bengal. He reached Bengal sometime after the death of his master in 1325 and settled in the urban center of Gaur-Pandua. Trained in the Chishti tradition, Aki Siraj led an austere life, distant from the royalty. But this did not stop sultans of Bengal like Alauddin Ali Shah and Samsuddin Ilyas Shah to seek his blessings. Aki Siraj in the mid-14th century and was buried in Lucknowti, where his shrine still attracts numerous devotees across regions and faiths on the occasion of the Urs, usually celebrated on the day of the Eid al-Fitr. On this occasion, a great fair is held around the shrine of the saint, and relics from other important Sufi shrines in Bengal are brought into the shrine of Aki Siraj as a mark of respect. Alaul Haq, who became the foremost disciple of Aki Siraj, was born in Bengal of a high ancestry and took much pride in his lineage. He styled himself as the Ganj-e-Nabat, or storehouse of wealth, which sounded similar to the epithet of the grand old Chishti saint from Punjab, Baba Farid Ganj-e-Shakar, or the storehouse of sugar. Legend has it that Nizamuddin Aulia took serious offense at this audacity and cursed Allah-ul-Haq, which made him go dumb. He freed himself from the curse only when he became the disciple of Aki Siraj. The rise of Sheikh Ala-ul-Haq at the head of the Chishti line of saints in Bengal coincided with the political ascendancy of the independent Ilyas Shahi dynasty. Sultan Ilyas Shah dedicated a mosque in 1342 built in the memory of the saint. The inscription of the mosque extols the virtue of the saint Ala-ul-Haq, recognizing his contribution in blessing the nascent Sultanate of Bengal. Bengal witnessed the unfolding of a political drama whose script was similar to what happened in other regions of medieval South Asia. The rise of a breakaway dynasty from Delhi's central authority, helmed by a dynamic leader like Shamsuddin Ilyas Shah, who once served the very authority in Delhi, and he being blessed by an equally charismatic Sufi sheikh like Ala-ul-Haq from the lineage of South Asia's most reputed silsila of the Chishtis. Both individuals, the Sufi and the Sultan, fed off each other's fortunes, political and spiritual, by securing for his fledgling rule the blessings of a Chishti saint trained in the spiritual lineage of Nizamuddin Aulia, whose presence in Delhi blessed the Tughlaq dynasty. The Ilyas Shahis put up a strong challenge and a clear message of independence from Delhi. The support that Shamsuddin Ilyas Shah and Ala-ul-Haq extended towards one another created a bond that would outlast their lives for a long period to come. Ala-ul-Haq's son and successor, Nur Qutb Alam, was duly entrusted with the responsibility of being the torchbearer for the Chishtis in Bengal. Apart from managing his father's khanqa and following the life of an ascetic, Nur Qutb Alam presided over the fortunes of the Bengal Sultanate during its most formative phase, which was at the same time greatly challenging as well. Nur Qutb Alam's career as the premier Sufi saint of Bengal witnessed a severe crisis within the ranks of the Sultanate when Raja Ganesh, the traditional landholding aristocrat, usurped authority, supplanting the main line of the Ilyas Shahi dynasty with a series of puppet rulers. Suddenly, Bengal's resident Hindu class jumped up the ladder of power and social influence. Raja Ganesh, though a regent for his young son, wielded effective power, ruling ruthlessly under the reversal of fortunes for Bengal's Muslim elite, including the powerful Sufi sheikhs. He went to the extreme limits of persecuting important saints, banishing Nur Qutb Alam's son, Sheikh Anwar, and nephew Sheikh Zahid to Sonargaon, at the same time conspiring to kill the son of another Chishti saint, Sheikh Hussain Bhukkar Posh. Seeing the dark clouds of uncertainty over the Bengal Sultanate, and by conflating it with the future of Islam in Bengal, Nur Qutb Alam implored Ibrahim, the Sharqi Sultan of Jaunpur, to come to the rescue of the new Sultanate and also of the faith. Nur Qutb Alam considered it a pious duty for the Sharqi Sultan to save the lamp, I quote, save the lamp of Islamic religion, unquote, from extinction. It is debated among historians whether Ibrahim Sharqi at all attacked Bengal or not. But Raja Ganesh continued with his persecution of the Muslims to an extent that his emissaries eventually killed Nur Qutb Alam's son, Sheikh Anwar. Legend has it that as soon as Anwar was murdered in Sonargaon, Raja Ganesh too left the world. As the situation settled down politically in Bengal and the Ilyas Shahis could regain their political stability, every succeeding sultan to the throne of Bengal, in remembrance of the immeasurable contribution of the Sheikh towards ensuring the continuance of the Sultanate and of the faith in the region of Bengal, remained devoted to the successors of Nur Qutb Alam. Over the years, the saint's shrine in Pandava competed with the court of the Sultan in prestige and popularity, where millions paid their respects, and almost every Sultan of Bengal carried annual pilgrimages. It is evident that mystics like Alaul Haq and Nur Qutb Alam did not confine themselves to spiritual exercises alone, but responded to the exigencies of the situation and took an active interest in the political and religious climate of the region. At a time when the Sultanate of Bengal moved towards independence, these Sufi sheikhs contributed greatly towards building up a social order. Again, during the time of Raja Ganesh, when the future of the Delhi Sultanate was meshed in uncertainty, sheikhs like Nur Qutb Alam took proactive steps to protect it from the hands of the usurpers. Chishti saints perhaps had serious reasons, therefore, to believe that it was their truths of devotion and worship that, I quote, the lamp of Islamic religion was kept burning bright in the face of the wind of unbelief, unquote. But eventually what it led to was that Muslim scholars and mystics took advantage of this kind of an environment that was created, resulting in the growth of a prolific Muslim society in the most remote areas of Bengal. From the 14th century onwards, being accelerated over the 15th and the 16th century. As we move and arrive into the 16th century thereafter, the reception of Sufism moved beyond personalities to metaphysical concepts. And practices of Sufism came to be influenced by the local esoteric traditions of spirituality in Bengal. The first one of them, the Vaishnava Shahajiya, and second, the Yogic Tantric. The Vaishnava Shahajiya centered on and around the Leelas of Krishna, the tradition of the Krishna Prema Bhakti, devotion towards Krishna as the incarnation of Vishnu, as well as the embodiment of the emotion of love, human and divine, conceptualized as the beloved of Radha. The various interplays of emotional love through separation and union was seen as the natural and innate, or the Shahaj, way of expressing devotion towards the divine. The roots, sorry, I'll skip this part then. The Yogic Tantric tradition came to be practiced primarily by the followers of the Nath cult, who placed a strong emphasis on the human body as the site of spiritual power and its control as necessary to achieve spiritual prowess. These two currents became the primary influence among Bengali Muslim writers of Sufi literature from the 16th century onwards, where the earliest influence came from the Nath tradition, followed by devotional Vaishnavism, whose emphasis on the emotion of love found a close parallel with the Sufi tradition, perhaps from the imagery of the woman lover that can be traced back to the personality of an early woman saint, Rabia, from West Asia. The circulation of Tantric yogic knowledge within Sufi circles in India dates back to the 13th century, the earliest horizon for institutionalized Sufi activities in North India. Important Sufi works like the Fawaidul Fuad and the Khairul Majlis record interactions between Chishtis and Nath yogis, the latter being the primary transmitters of Tantric yogic knowledge and practice into Sufi kantras. A key marker in this circulation within Sufi circles is a Sanskrit manual on Tantric yoga entitled the Amrita Kunda, or the Pool of Nectar, that was translated into Persian and Arabic, the probable earliest one by Ruknuddin Samarkandi, the chief Qazi of Lucknowti in the early 13th century. The Chishti Sabri master, Abdul Quddus Gangohi, in the 16th century taught yogic practices to his disciples and incorporated yogic ideas from the Amrita Kunda into his work, the Rushd Nama. During his exile in Gujarat, the Shattari saint, Sheikh Muhammad Ghaus, again in the mid-16th century, undertook a Persian recension of the work titled the Baharul Hayat. Embedding of yogic tantric texts like the Amrita Kunda within practices of classical Sufism clearly indicate an esoteric space where Indian Sufis were drawn deep into yogic practices, yet resisted any fusion by engaging with two independent spiritual traditions having conceptual parallels. The first one, the exploration of the human body as the site of spiritual power through the formulas of yogic tantrism, combining it with the classical Sufi idea of man as the embodiment of divine qualities and attributes. The second, the Sufi practice of zikr, combining bodily postures with respiratory control, with asana, mudra, and pranayama. This probably could be the historical context in which later 16th century texts like the Yoga Kalandar and many other works emerged in Bengal, drawing generously from the yogic tantric traditions. I will briefly go through two such works as an example, the Yoga Kalandar and later the Har Gauri Samvad. In Middle Bengali, the best exposition of Sufism and yoga in the style of a text on Islamic yoga is Sayyid Murtaza's Yoga Kalandar, argued to be the foundational Sufi manual extant in oral form before it was written down. All later Sufi text is said to have followed this in style and content. The work sticks to the foundational stages of Sufi spirituality, the Shariat, Tariqat, Haqiqat, and Marifat, that are connected to the four corresponding stations or maqams, Nasut, Malkut, Jabrut, and Lahut. In limiting the number of maqams to four, some scholars have seen a strong influence of Tantric Buddhism that may have been the outcome of Sufi Buddhist interactions in regions of Central Asia as the latter declined in India. Or perhaps the author of the text, Yoga Kalandar, was aware of the meditational practices of Tantric Buddhism in Bengal, focusing on the four chakras, Nasut with Muladhara, Malkut with Manipura, Jabrut with Aggo, and Lahut with Anahat. That this branch of esoteric knowledge was widely transmitted in Sufi circles of Bengal is evident from similarly titled manuscripts over the 17th and the 18th century written by Muslim scholars. In these works, Sufi concepts are freely mixed with yogic ideas and practices drawn from Tantra and Hatha Yoga, making it deep-rooted eclectic practice in the Bengal esoteric world. The emphasis of the text, Yoga Kalandar, is on the performance of yogic psychophysiological exercises through the control of the energy channels where vital energy circulates and the nerve plexuses of the chakras where cosmic energy rests in a latent state. Sayyid Murtaza's work begins with the standard verses of praise to the Lord or the Niranjan, the Prophet and his companions, and the mercy of Allah, who is recognized as the creator of the 18,000 worlds or the Alam. Thereafter, the author sets out to reveal the secrets of the four stations to the reader. I will read out the description of the first station, the station of the Nasut, which is described as the sacrum, a triangular bone lying at the junction where the spinal cord meets the pelvic bone. The angel Azrael stands guard there. This cavity is the place of the fire, which burns continuously and is not extinguished. The sun, carrying a highly symbolic meaning in the yogic tantric practice as the source of fire, is situated in the region of the Muladhara, the end of the spinal cord and the lowest plexus in the yogic tantric physiology between the anal orifice and the genital organs. It carries the form of a red lotus with four petals. The individual soul is its lord. In this station, the disciple is meant to carry on the practice of zikr on the kalima or the Islamic credo with closed ears and eyes while continuing to adore the master or the murshid in order to find the right way. The last of the practices of adoring the master and the murshid is clearly reminiscent of the Sufi practice of the tasawwur-e-sheikh. The station of the Malkut is located in the lumbar region of the navel, where which yogis identify with the Manipur chakra having a blue lotus with 10 petals. The station of the Jabrut is located in the root of the palate in the region of the brain, where many things are located. This place is presided over by the angel Mikhail, and this is identified with the Agga chakra, which has a white lotus with 2 petals. The final station is the Lahut, which is the maqams situated in the heart of the human body under the guardianship of the angel Gabriel. This is the station which is also identified as the throne of the Lord. The Yoga Calendar identifies the Maqam of the Lahut with the image of the power and authority connected to the tantric notion of the Shakti. In Sufism, the Shariat marks the first of the 4 stages concerned with Islamic canons and laws. A complete training in these requirements takes the individual towards tariqat, or the way where the disciple undertakes training in spiritual discipline under the careful supervision of the sheikh and in the company of other disciples. On the completion of these 2 stages, the disciple begins to realize the hakikat, or the 3rd stage, concerning the attributes of God within himself. Thereafter, he is prepared to realize the oneness with God in the final stage of marifat, or the knowledge of gnosis. Yoga Calendar associates each stage with a maqam, or a station, which in Sufism is paralleled by the latifas, or subtle centers of illumination in the human body, that is gradual in its essence, depending on the stations achieved, and characterized by an unmistakable and irreplaceable spiritual experience during the practice of zikr. In the text, these Sufi maqams, which yogis prefer to also engage in, are synchronized perfectly with the yogic tantric chakras as immaterial subtle centers conceived to aid meditation without any objective and physical presence within the human body. In the Sufi concept, every individual soul has to struggle and survive in the way towards divine union, piercing through the layers of worldly attachments. That is the cause of forgetfulness of the primordial bond between the soul and its creator at the moment of creation. This is equated with the individual self and is connected with the Lord, while at the same time separate from it. The interesting connection with Sufism in the text of the Yoga Calendar is through the emphasis on the role of the master or the murshid in identifying the pool of nectar, or the Amrita Kunda. Yoga Calendar, as a spiritual and meditational text of mixed origins, carried a strong influence of Natha philosophy, combining it with Sufi metaphysics circulating in Bengal at that point of time. The next work, at around the same time, written a bit later in the early 18th century, is Sheikh Chand's Hargauri Sambad. This work follows a style generic in Middle Bengali literature, where Shiva engages in a conversation with his consort Gauri to share the esoteric secrets of Tantra and Yoga tradition. This work represents a strong tradition of continuous local influence of yogic and tantric motifs on the Muslim writers of the Sufi tradition. That medieval Bengali Muslim writers on Sufism were not experimenting with local esoteric traditions, but had a diverse yet serious audience in mind, is made evident in a very unique manner. A parallel text of the Hargauri Sambad, carrying the title of the Talibnama, or the text for the Wayfarer, was written for a Muslim audience, where the esoteric concepts of yoga sadhana, or contemplation, were presented in a modified manner. In the Talibnama, Shiva is replaced, understandably, by Sheikh Chand's own Peer Shah Daula, and the recipient of the knowledge is the author Sheikh Chand himself. Chand creates 2 narrative frameworks meant to appeal to his readers from the 2 communities who would associate themselves with the Hindu god Shiva and the Muslim Sufi saint Shah Daula as preservers of esoteric knowledge, and hence in a position to explain the intricacies of the same to their individual listeners, Shiva's consort Gauri and Shah Daula's disciple Chand. By using 2 distinct sets of religious spiritual vocabulary, Chand does not attempt to mediate one cultural world into another. Rather, he builds up a narrative where the cultural worlds of Hinduism and Islam, primarily represented through Tantra and Sufi traditions, is shown in equivalence. The opening lines from the Hargauri Sambad is what is on the screen right now, where Chand describes the attributes of the formless before specifying the main gods from the Hindu pantheon, equating them with important angels before offering respect to the rest of the Hindu gods and the angels. The lesser gods and seers from the Hindu tradition are offered respects alongside the most important personalities in Islam. This is the introduction from the Talibnama, where Sheikh Chand brings in the Islamic Lord, then the Prophet, his companions, the caliphs, the daughter, the grandsons of the Prophet, and reference to the holy places of Mecca and Medina. The conversation that takes place around the origins of creation and the universe is the longest section in both the Hargaudi Samvad and Talibnama. In the former, Gauri's curiosity on the secrets of creation is expressed through a number of questions to Shiva. On the form of the Lord at the beginning, the creation of the Lord, his color and essence, the formation of the three worlds, heaven, earth, etc. In the Talibnama, this same description is a bit longer and interspersed with Arabic terminologies. The description is close to the Hargaudi Samvad, and the poet, as a disciple, begins by asking his peer on the very essential questions of the qualities of the Lord, his name, essence, form, and the secrets of creation. The description of creation ends with the peer narrating how the Lord, in his own image, converses with his creation, invoking a direct reference to the powerful imagery of the primordial covenant as described in the Quran, whereby all created souls are bound to their creator through the original emotion of love and attachment, which a Sufi seeker attempts to replicate in his material existence, striving for union with the divine. In the Talibnama, the Lord, after creating creation from the light of Muhammad, asks the souls as to who is their creator, to which all souls reply uniformly, recognizing Allah as breathing life into them and causing death in this material world. Clearly, in this kind of a textual representation, what becomes important is the dominant interaction with the regional Nath cult, influenced by yoga and tantric physiology, which was adopted by Muslim writers in Bengal when engaging with Sufi traditions, while at the same time incorporating extensive reference to Arabic phrases and Quranic metaphors for an evidently Muslim audience. I think I'm kind of done with my time of 15 minutes, so I can skip the last theme and move into the conclusion. Probably, Professor Hassan, you may suggest.
Please go ahead. Yeah, just conclude.
Yeah.
Yes, Kashshaf, do you want to conclude now?
Yes, I'll go ahead with the conclusion. That's what
Please do.
would suggest. Yes. The ease with which Muslim writers in Bengal combined Sufi principles with these practices of local esoteric traditions brings forward an important trend whereby evidence is hard to come by, where cross-cultural practices from the 16th century like these were in any way determined by the Islamic identity of the writers, either of the Nath tradition or of the Vaishnava tradition. As boundaries between Islam and non-Islam do not seem to harden before the 19th century, perhaps a more reasonable way to explain such fluid and eclectic interactions involving Islam and Sufism with local Bengali traditions would be to explore elements from both sides that could have contributed towards facilitating such cultural adaptations. This kind of flows in continuity with what I started off as the early careers of the Sufi saints in Bengal, who were traced primarily as historical figures through contemporary records, as well as through the practice of remembrance and historical memory. Thereafter, the role that these saints played in the consolidation of political authority of the Bengal Sultanate from the 14th century onwards, moving into an intense interaction not only with the ruling elite, but also with the local subject. population in multifarious ways. Before we reach a time when the importance of these living personalities transform into a tendency where they are turned into tomb cults or shrine cults. And the memory of these saints becomes enshrined around the physical existence of these shrine cults. Thereafter, much later in the 17th century, that the historical remembrance of these saints would perhaps resurface once more along the theme of the Pir, the popular cult of Bengali saints that would pervade the eastern countryside as well as the forested regions of southern Bengal, that I have to skip for want of time. But I would then conclude by saying that these are important manifestations of the reception of Sufism in medieval Bengal in multifarious ways, not only through their spiritual practices, but also through the kind of ways in they were accepted within the society and they were remembered historically. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, how do we proceed, Soumya, now?
Yes, sir. So I can read out the questions from the chat box and sir can answer.
I would actually suggest that we usually read out the ones that come from Facebook, but since we do have some people from the department who have questions, Amit and Shakir have put up questions, so maybe they would like to ask the speaker themselves.
Yeah, that would be better.
That would be better. And then after that, if anyone else has a question, please indicate. And after that, the ones we can read out if there's time left.
Right. Okay.
That's okay. So Amit first, and then Shakir, and then I think Aditi.
Aditi.
Has a question.
Amit, are you there in the meeting?
Otherwise, Shakir, if you can ask your question first.
Hello, sir.
Yes, Shakir, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for this talk, sir. Sir, I'm also working on Tazkiras. I'm basically working on Kashmir, on 3 Sufi Tazkiras from 16th, 17th century.
So sorry for the interruption. What are you working with, Shakir?
Sir, I'm working Shalin, sir.
Okay, lovely. Okay.
Yeah, yes, sir. Sir, my question is my query because I'm working with these Persian Tazkiras. In 16th and even 17th centuries, one of the important themes, recurrent themes with these Tazkiras is that they always constantly try to, show that every Sufi, for example, from their order, like Kubrawiyas or Sohrawadis or Rishi order, from people from Rishi order, everyone is trying to, plot their Sufi as Islamizing saint. Secondly, even in 17th century, these people start contesting with each other. Is this problem general with all the Tazkiras or it is just specific to Kashmir? I want to know about these Tazkiras basically, this genre of Tazkira.
Shakir, your second point about contestation, can you kindly repeat it?
Yes, sir, because these Sufis, particularly in Kashmir, when they interact with the local rishis, they don't adopt their everything from the rishi tradition. They just try to intervene in their working also through different cultural motifs, like how they should wear and how they should dress up, how they should eat. These bodily traits are very important when they write about the rishis. So rishis are also contesting; they are also writing at that time. So my question is that through these Tazkiras, because Tazkiras have great impact on writing of Tariq then in 17th century. That's why I was very curious to know about that. Is this general problem with the Tazkira genre throughout South Asia? That this Islamizing saint and these contestations and appropriations.
Tazkiras are, of course, as you said,
Yes, sir.
Tazkiras are, of course, as you said, very important sources for understanding South Asian Sufism. But then, like all texts, they too have to be approached with a bit of caution and keeping in mind the kind of what do you call the politics of textual writing that goes on behind these Tazkira literature. As I referred to while I was discussing the first section, Tazkiras primarily are life stories of saints, but at a certain point, they are also life stories which are projected into a kind of a large canvas, which these biographers choose to adapt as they wish. And uh, their ideas, their understanding of the past, their stereotypes, biases get projected into that larger canvas of Tazkira writing. So Sufis thereafter become just tools which carry out the intention which the Tazkira writers want them to do under the guise of textual writing. With the issue of Islamization, with the issue of Islamization, an important thing is that these Tazkiras on most occasions are bent on portraying saints as marking a clear break, marking a clear separation between the Islamic and the pre-Islamic period, which historically, either in Bengal or in Kashmir, is difficult to is difficult to point out. A clear break in historical processes, whether it is the Islamic or the pre-Islamic or the Sufi or the pre-Sufi, these are breaks which are difficult to identify. Historical processes move along ways which are long drawn, and there are gray areas which make it interesting to study. By emphasizing on processes of Islamization, these Tazkiras are on most of the time intent on marking a clean break from the past, which is in itself problematic. And Sufi saints, as markers of a clean break from the historical past, either the pre-Islamic or the pre-Sufi, on most occasions, they do not fit into this role, as these Tazkiras would want to portray them. So one needs to be a bit careful while reading into these sweeping generalizations that come as describing the careers of these saints. On issues of contestation, I'm not very aware of what happens in Kashmir with regard to the Rishi saints and the Islamic Sufis, but it is also not very accurate to speak of a situation where Sufi practices fuse into one another, like it happens in the case of Bengal. Sufi and Vaishnava practices, or Sufi and yogic practices, don't fuse into one another. They borrow from one another, but they still keep some basic identity among themselves.
Good. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Aditi?
Good evening, sir, and thank you so much for the wonderful lecture.
Thank
I
you.
just had a very small question. So, as you were mentioning about the close interaction between the Sufis and the Sultans of Bengal, I was just wondering about how it's a little different from the way we see things happening in Delhi at the same time. I mean, Professor Sunil Kumar has discussed at length in his article about how Nizamuddin Aulia is actually considered to be the real authority, as you've already mentioned, but we do not actually see the Sultan and the Sufi interacting. In fact, there was a sense of competition between the two. So, I mean, I was just wondering if you can just throw some light on that, if there's a reason why the situation was different in Bengal. Also, another question, I found the last section of your paper very interesting, wherein you were discussing about the cross interaction between the local tradition and the Sufi tradition. Since I'm also kind of trying to figure out a similar pattern in 17th century Mughal Persianate writings. So, I mean, how do we study these interactions if we want to go beyond the religious boundaries? I mean, because the same religious boundaries as we know today were not applicable in the 17th century. So, I mean, what could be a better paradigm to analyze these interactions between, especially the textual interactions?
For the first question on competition, in the case of Bengal, I would not agree that it's only cooperation. There was a sense of competition as well, which I very briefly mentioned when I spoke about Alaul Haq and the Ilyas Shahis, that they would constantly feed of one another's sense of authority, and in the case of Bengal also, both the Sultan and important Sufi saints, in this case, if we take the Chishtis, were very aware of the kind of authority they exercised, or the kind of authority they displayed. So, a Sufi sense of authority is not limited just to spiritual practices, but also to a range of welfare activities which takes place around the institutions of the Khanqa and the public opinion, as well as control the kind of following which they have behind themselves, determine to a large extent the tensions that that existed among them. In the case of Bengal, also in the later part of Nur Qutb Alam's career, we see tensions arising between him and the later Ilyas Shahis, to the extent that the later Ilyas Shahis almost started to keep a safe distance from Nur Qutb Alam. His authority had somewhat started to make the Sultan cautious of their own position in Bengal itself. It was only when Nur Qutb Alam passed away that the Sultans of Bengal once again started proactively patronizing the tomb shrines or the shrines of the Chishti saints. That was much easier for them to take care of, and that was much easier for them to negotiate, because as it is very popularly said, dead saints don't reply back. So that is a phenomenon that we also get to see in the case of Bengal as well, a sense of competition and contest existing between the Sufi and the Sultan at certain times, depending on the idea of authority which each of them projected. For reading texts like these, actually, I'm also working through these texts, and there may not be a very conclusive answer to the question as to what kind of a paradigm needs to be followed. But what we need to perhaps keep in mind is that these Middle Bengali writers who were tapping into the corpus of Vaishnava or Natha spiritual esoteric traditions of Bengal were not seeing this corpus of knowledge and mystical tradition at odds with their own training in Sufi metaphysics. And a sectarian, tightly knit religious identity that we get to see from the 18th, that we get to see from the 19th century was perhaps not at work in the time that we are looking at in the 16th, 17th, and 18th. And scholars like Sayyid Murtaza or for that matter, Sheikh Chand were comfortable in negotiating both these domains of knowledge, the local Bengali esoteric world of spirituality, as well as their own background of being trained in Sufi metaphysics. So it is important to keep in mind that we are not looking at interactions, say, in the sense of two strictly conceptualized, identified religious traditions, but we are looking at interactions between spiritual traditions where overlapping trends of practice and ideas of cosmology, creation, spiritual tradition are acceptable and are exchanged at a much more conceivable manner.
Okay, so Khurshid Khan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I want to ask a question. I have to ask Kashshaf, congratulations for your paper. And then I just want to ask that the authorial location of the authors of the retrospective hagiography that you talked of, where the Sufis are positioned as warriors, and the audience they are catering to, and what was the need for such positioning? I would like to know that. And the other thing I would like to know, the kind of appropriation of Rabia that takes place in Bengali amongst the Bengali Sufis, because I've studied of her appropriation amongst the Shishtiyas and the purposes. I have, and then a third thing I would like to comment is Amritakunda is lost. This Sanskrit text is lost. It was first translated into Arabic, and 44 copies are all over Central Asia. The maximum is in Turkey. And what Shatari Saint was translated was from the Arabic to Persian. And the way, and I would like to ask to what extent the Islamization of the text takes place in Bengal by when the translation is done. And Yoga Calendar also, in his Yoga Calendar that you talked about, what kind of, does he maintain the Sanskritic idioms or does he Islamize the text? To what extent does he Islamize the text?
Okay. I'll start with the warrior question first. Why warrior? I mean, there may not be a definite answer to this, but the kind of audience, perhaps towards which these texts were addressed, were interested in knowing, as I hinted at a certain kind of the origin of Islam in Bengal from the period of the early 13th century. And their emphasis of these authors on a kind of violence that was used or unleashed in the garb of jihad on the resident local authority was reflective of their own surroundings in the 19th century and the kind of developments which was happening in Bengal in the 19th century with the rise of the reformist tradition and emphasis at the what you call the triumph of Islam over local authorities, cultural practices, local institutions. This triumph was conceived primarily along lines of warfare, violence, and hostilities. And the heroes of this triumph were then conveniently borrowed from the historical figures of the early Sufi saints who arrived in Bengal at this point of time. So that you get to see later day biographies of Shah Jalal taking on two different set of narratives. The earlier one describes him as from a Central Asian origin, being trained in Central Asia and then in Baghdad. The later geography that indicates and clearly draws his ancestry from Yemen, perhaps indication at the trend of Arabization, which may have picked up in Bengal from the early 19th century. Regarding the appropriation of Rabia, I'm not very clear in what ways this took place. But though I am aware that important figures from the history, important women figures from the history of Islam, like the daughter of the Prophet Fatima, saints like Rabia were appropriated as models of, say, women's behavior or women's piety, which came to be conceptualized through writings which were meant to be moral advices for women in the context of, say, from the 19th century Bengali, from the 19th century Bengali Muslim intelligentsia as models of behavior. Apart from that, the appropriation of Rabia in Bengal's spiritual environment, that I am immediately not aware of. Amritakunda, I agree with what you said. The Sanskrit version is lost, and the later day renditions are from the non-Sanskrit copies of it. Amritakunda, as far as I know, I may be wrong, does not return back to Bengal after its initial presence around the 13th century. And what we see with the 16th and the 17th century esoteric texts on the Sufi tradition, like the Yoga Kalanda drawing on the Natha traditions, is not a fusion of Sufi and Nath practices, but a kind of a textual attempt at drawing equivalence and a process of what scholars have called translatability of Sufi Sufi cosmology, esoteric practices, as well as local esoteric practices from the Natha background being brought together in a compatible manner, so that along with the emphasis on practices of the specific Nath rituals, what you also see is an emphasis on the practice of the Sufi zikr, the practice of the tasawwur-e-sheikh, or the adoration of the sheikh, the importance of the murshid, the importance of the kalima as the basic formula of zikr, even within a Kalandari text like that of the Yoga Kalanda. And the title itself, if we would want to go deeper, then the title itself shows a combination of two antinomian tendencies, the Kalandari and the Yoga.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I will read out the questions by Amit Day now.
Sure.
Okay, so Bibi Roshan was a 13th century woman Sufi who was peace-loving and never had a warrior image. What was the attitude of male Sufis towards women Sufis? And there's another question. We notice vernacularization of major Sufi texts in 16th century Bengal, but we notice similar practice among North Indian Sufis only from the 18th century. Why is that? So these two questions are from Amit Day, and then
I might take the second question first on the vernacularization. The process of vernacularization from 16th, 17th century Bengal, the clue to this process may perhaps be located in the patronization of Bengali language and culture from the late 15th century by the Hussain Shahi dynasty of Bengal, and the active support which the Hussain Shahi rulers gave to the practice of Bengali language, textual productions in Bengali, a range of non-Islamic texts written in Bengali, patronage to poets, extending their support to a Bengali cultural world. This could have been a very important reason why this vernacularization could progress from the 16th and the 17th century, taking encouragement or supported by the state patronization of Bengali. In North India, on the other hand, we see an active support for the Persian language, the Persianate cultural world, the Mughal policies at making Persian the language of the empire, and adopting the trends, the symbols, and the practices of the Persianate cultural world. But one thing which can be pointed out in this case regarding North India also is a certain degree of vernacularization which happens with regard to with regard to texts like Chandayan and Meghavati and Padmavati by poets like Maulana Dawood and similar authors who were trained in the Sufi tradition, and they chose to write not in Persian, but the North Indian vernacular. So example is not altogether missing, but we need to keep in mind the overarching push towards Persianization in Northern Bengal from the 16th century onwards.
Okay, so as we are running short of time, so I'll just read the last comment and one question to you, and then we can wrap up. So the question is by Yusra Farooqi. What was the role of Sufism in making of intellectual tradition, and how the intellectual tradition evolved around the Sufi khanqahs? And there's a comment by Indrashish Banerjee via Facebook. The larger canvas is a construct largely depicting a larger than life story of the actual propounders. I'm giving to understand, sir, where portrayals are opinionated and both by default and design. So it's over to you.
The intellectual tradition around Sufi khankas were kind of multifarious. It not only focused on the everyday practice of the spiritual training and the reading of doctrinal text and text having being used for the training of disciples, but also, as I said, individuals who were trained in Sufi khankas but took up other kinds of professions. A very good example of how intellectual traditions in khankas influenced scholars is that of Amir Khusro, being a disciple of Nizamuddin Aulia, and his range of works that you get to see, which are on the one hand influenced by Chishti spirituality. Some of them are not. They are works more oriented towards political history. At the regional centers, this intellectual tradition got manifested through the creation of works in regional languages, like works that would be produced in Dakhani in the Deccan, or just as I elaborated on in the language of Middle Bengali in the region of Bengal, which dealt with Sufi esoteric concepts, but at the same time popular literature as well, and most importantly, training manuals, which could be disseminated across a wider geography, keeping in mind not only the training of a particular master, but also that of the silsila, or the order to which the master belonged. The other important intellectual tradition which originated from Sufi khankas would be the kind of literature that got produced. Collection of the oral discourses of Sufi saints, collection of letters and writings of Sufi masters, as well as instructional treatises that would be written both by the masters and the disciples themselves, that would at a certain point of time work as models that would fill the gap in the physical absence of that particular saint by capturing his spiritual message or by capturing his oral discourses. Regarding the comment on the portrayals, I would largely accept what the comment indicated, and as I already elaborated, later they motivation and subjectivity embedded in those works as well.
Thank you so much, sir. As we are done with the questions, Farad sir, would you like to add something?
No, I just what I need to say is to thank Kashshaf for an extremely important and interesting paper. I really enjoyed your paper, and I was particularly impressed by the discussion on the shifting social memories and as to how the Sufis came to be represented in extremely militaristic terms in the 19th century as invested with with an exclusive religious militant ideology. And that was very fascinating. I also found the discussion on the yogic texts written by the Sufis in the 17th century particularly interesting aspect of your presentation. So thanks a lot, Kashshaf. I learned a lot from your presentation.
Thank you, Professor Hassan, and I thank the Department of History, Delhi University once again for extending this invitation and this wonderful opportunity to share this work with all of you. And I thank the audience for their patience and the questions and the feedback, which I'm sure will lead to a couple of more drafts, if not more. And that will be a very concrete contribution once this essay is ready and it's complete for the press. So thank you all, and thanks for this opportunity and for the wonderful discussion it led to.
Thank you so much, Kashshaf sir, for an insightful talk, and hoping for an interaction in person post-COVID. Sure. And I would like to inform about the next talk we have on 11th August by Dr. Madhumita Sen Gupta on Assam history. And it's on Zoom itself. Hoping to see you all there too. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining.